The morning it all fell apart started like any other Tuesday in suburban Dallas. I was standing in my kitchen, the one I had personally renovated 2 years ago with the granite countertops I'd saved up for, and the backsplash tiles I'd installed myself on weekends, watching the coffee maker sputter to life while the Texas sun blazed through the window, already fierce at 7 in the morning. The air conditioning hummed its familiar song, fighting against the heat that would climb into the high 90s by noon. I had no idea that in less than 3 hours, I would be standing on that same street carrying boxes of my belongings, while my entire life crumbled around me like cheap drywall. My name is Sarah, and I had been married to Derek for 6 years. We'd met at a barbecue joint off Highway 75, one of those places with picnic tables outside and smoke billowing from a real wood pit. He'd smiled at me over his brisket plate, sauce on his chin, completely unself-conscious, and I'd fallen for that easy confidence, that Texas charm that felt like coming home, even though I'd grown up in the same city, and should have known better than to trust a smile that came so easy. We bought the house together 3 years into our marriage, a modest 3-bedroom ranch style in Garland. Nothing fancy but ours, with a yard big enough for the dog we always talked about getting, and a garage where Derek kept his tools scattered across a workbench he never actually used. The problem started about 18 months ago, when Derek's mother, Patricia, broke her hip. She'd been living alone in Fort Worth since Derek's father passed, getting by with the stubbornness that seemed to be a family trait, refusing help from anyone even when it was clear she needed it. The fall happened in her bathroom, a stupid accident that could have been prevented if she'd just let Derek install those grab bars he'd offered to put in a dozen times. She called Derek from the hospital, not me, never me, and when he hung up the phone, his face had that set expression I'd learned, meant he'd already made a decision without consulting me. Patricia moved into our guest room 2 weeks later. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she finished physical therapy and could manage on her own again. That's what Derek promised me, standing in our bedroom while I folded laundry, and tried to hide my frustration, tried to be the understanding wife who didn't complain about her mother-in-law moving in. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that family helps family, all those platitudes people say when they're trying to convince themselves to accept something they know deep down is going to change everything. From the first day, Patricia made it clear she didn't think I was good enough for her son. It wasn't anything she said outright at first, nothing I could point to and call her out on, just little comments that landed like paper cuts. The way she'd look at the dinner I'd cooked and say, "Derek always loved his chicken fried a different way," or how she'd straighten the pillows on the couch after I'd just arranged them. A small disapproving shake of her head like I couldn't even manage basic housekeeping. She had opinions about everything from how I organized the pantry to the temperature I kept the thermostat at, never mind that the electric bill had my name on it too. Derek changed with her there. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe I was just finally seeing who he'd always been underneath that charming smile. He started deferring to his mother on everything, asking her opinion on things we used to decide together, spending his evenings watching television with her instead of talking to me like we used to. When I tried to discuss it with him, tried to explain that I felt like a guest in my own home, he'd get defensive, accuse me of being jealous of his mother, tell me I was being dramatic. "She's old and she's hurt, Sarah," he'd say, that edge in his voice that warned me not to push further. "Can't you just be patient? She'll be gone soon enough." But months passed, and Patricia's hip healed and she didn't leave. She'd finished physical therapy, gotten the all clear from her doctor, could walk just fine with barely a limp, but somehow there was always a reason she needed to stay a little longer. The housing market in Fort Worth was bad, she claimed, though I knew her house had been paid off for years. She had another doctor's appointment coming up. The weather was too hot to move. The holidays were coming, and wouldn't it be nice to spend them together? Derek nodded along to every excuse, and I felt myself becoming invisible in my own home, my own marriage, like I was slowly being erased. The morning of that Tuesday, I'd woken up determined to address it once and for all. I'd been rehearsing what I'd say to Derek, trying to find the right words that wouldn't make him defensive, that would make him understand that this situation couldn't continue. We'd both worked hard for this house, both put our names on that mortgage, but increasingly it felt like Patricia's house, with Patricia's rules, and I was just someone who happened to live there and pay half the bills. I poured my coffee into the ceramic mug Derek had given me on our first anniversary, the one with Mrs. Morrison painted on it in delicate script, and walked into the living room where I found them both sitting on the couch, Derek and Patricia, close together like conspirators, their voices low and urgent. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. which was how I knew something was seriously wrong. Patricia had this look on her face, satisfied and triumphant, like a cat that had finally cornered a mouse after a long hunt. "Sarah, we need to talk," Derek said, and those 4 words, delivered in that flat tone with no warmth in his eyes, made my stomach drop. I knew before he said anything else that whatever was coming was bad, really bad, the kind of bad that doesn't get fixed with a conversation or an apology. I sat down in the armchair across from them, my coffee cooling in my hands, and Derek wouldn't look at me directly. He kept his eyes somewhere over my shoulder, while Patricia sat there with her hands folded in her lap, perfectly composed, waiting for the show to start. "This isn't working out," Derek said finally. "Mom and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you moved out for a while. Give everyone some space to figure things out." The words didn't make sense at first. I actually laughed, a short, shocked sound, because surely he was joking. Surely this was some kind of misunderstanding. "Move out?" I repeated. "Of my own house? The house I pay for?" "It's not just your house," Patricia said, speaking up for the first time, her voice sharp and clear. "Derek's name is on that deed too, and he's my son. He needs to take care of his mother. And frankly, Sarah, you've made it very clear you're not comfortable with me being here. So perhaps it's better if you're the one who leaves." I looked at Derek, waiting for him to contradict her, to tell her she was out of line, to remember that he'd married me, made vows to me, chose me, but he just sat there, jaw set, still not meeting my eyes. "Derek," I said, and I hated how my voice shook, how desperate I sounded. "You can't be serious. This is our home. We built this life together. Maybe we were too young when we got married," he said. And now he did look at me, and there was nothing in his expression, no love, no regret, just this cold determination that made him look like a stranger. "Maybe we made a mistake. Mom thinks we should take a break, figure out if this is really what we both want. Mom thinks. Not I think. Not we think. Mom thinks." And right there I understood that I'd already lost, that whatever conversation they'd been having before I walked in, they'd made their decision, and I wasn't part of it. "I want you out by the end of the day," Derek continued. "You can take your personal stuff, but the furniture stays. We'll figure out the rest later." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking back to the bedroom. The next hour passed in a blur of disbelief and growing panic, my hands moving automatically, pulling clothes from hangers, grabbing toiletries from the bathroom, packing my life into cardboard boxes I found in the garage, the same boxes we'd used when we moved in, our names still written on them in faded marker from 3 years ago when we'd been happy. Or at least I thought we'd been happy. Maybe I'd been happy alone. Derek stayed in the living room with his mother the whole time. He didn't come to check on me, didn't offer to help, didn't say he was sorry, or that this was a mistake. I kept expecting him to walk through the door and tell me he'd changed his mind, but he never did. At some point I heard Patricia's voice, couldn't make out the words but could hear the satisfaction in her tone, and I realized she'd been planning this, working on Derek slowly, turning him against me bit by bit until he couldn't see clearly anymore, couldn't remember that he'd once loved me enough to promise forever. By noon, I had 6 boxes packed and nowhere to go. I'd moved to Dallas from Houston for a job right after college, and most of my friends were couple friends. Derek's friends, really. People who would probably side with him if they had to choose. My mother had passed when I was in high school, and my older sister lived in Phoenix with her own family, her own problems. That left my father. Dad lived in Oak Cliff, in the same small house where I'd spent my teenage years after Mom died. He was 63 now, retired from his job as a mechanic at a Ford dealership, spending his days working on classic cars in his garage and watching Rangers games on television. We had a complicated relationship, Dad and I. He'd done his best after Mom died, but raising a grieving teenage daughter had been beyond him, and I'd left for college at 18 and never really come back, building my life elsewhere, keeping him at a distance because it was easier than dealing with all the old pain and awkwardness between us. But he was the only person I could think to call. I sat on the bed I'd shared with Derek, surrounded by boxes, and dialed his number with shaking hands. He answered on the 3rd ring with his usual gruff, "Yeah? Dad, it's Sarah," I said, and my voice cracked despite my best efforts to keep it together. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, and I heard him mute the television in the background, heard the creak of his recliner as he sat up. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a confused rush about Derek and Patricia and being kicked out, and through it all Dad didn't interrupt. just listened with those long pauses between my sentences, where I could hear him breathing, processing. When I finally ran out of words, there was a moment of silence before he said simply, "I'm coming to get you. Dad, you don't have to. Give me the address. I'm leaving now." He hung up before I could argue, and I sat there holding the phone, feeling like a child again, helpless and confused and grateful that someone, anyone, was coming. I finished packing, moving through the house like a ghost, taking only what was clearly mine, not wanting to give Derek or Patricia any ammunition to use against me later. I left the wedding photos on the mantel, the kitchen gadgets we'd gotten as wedding presents, the furniture we'd bought together, all the physical evidence of a marriage that apparently meant nothing anymore. I carried the first box out to the curb, just as Dad's beat-up Ford pickup turned onto the street. It was nearly 1 o'clock, and the sun was directly overhead, brutal and unforgiving, the heat rising off the asphalt in visible waves. I was wearing jeans and an old t-shirt, my hair pulled back in a ponytail, sweat already running down my back, and I must have looked exactly like what I was, a woman who'd just lost everything, standing on a suburban street with her life in cardboard boxes. Dad pulled up and got out of the truck without a word. He was wearing his usual uniform of worn jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his weathered face unreadable under his Dallas Cowboys cap. He looked at me, then at the box in my arms, then at the house behind me where I knew Derek and Patricia were probably watching from the window. He walked over, took the box from my hands, and said just 3 words that somehow made everything both better and worse at the same time. "You're coming home." Not a question, a statement. And something inside me broke at the certainty in his voice, the absolute acceptance. No judgment or questions or demands for explanation. Just, "You're coming home." I started crying then, ugly sobbing that I couldn't control, all the fear and humiliation and grief pouring out right there on the street. And Dad set the box down and pulled me into an awkward hug, his hand patting my back the way he used to when I was little and had nightmares. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We'll get through this. Let's get your stuff loaded up." We worked in silence for the next 30 minutes, carrying boxes from the house to the truck. Derek never came outside. Patricia appeared once in the doorway, watching with her arms crossed, making sure I wasn't taking anything that wasn't mine, I guess. And Dad looked at her with such cold contempt that she actually stepped back inside. When the truck was loaded, I went back one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. The house felt different already, like it had rejected me, spit me out, made it clear I'd never belonged there in the first place. I stood in the bedroom doorway for just a moment, looking at the bed with its blue comforter that I'd picked out, the dresser with Derek's wallet and keys sitting on top, the wedding photo on his nightstand that he hadn't bothered to turn face down. 6 years of marriage, ended on a Tuesday afternoon because his mother decided I wasn't good enough, and he was too weak to stand up to her. I found Derek in the kitchen, drinking a beer even though it wasn't even 2 in the afternoon, not looking at me. "I guess this is it," I said, and I was proud that my voice came out steady. He nodded, staring at his beer bottle. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce paperwork." The word divorce hung in the air between us. I'd been kicked out of my house, but somehow hearing him say that word made it all real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't a separation, wasn't a break, wasn't something we were going to work through. This was the end, final, and absolute, and he'd already moved on to lawyers and paperwork while I was still trying to process what was happening. "Why?" I asked, and I wasn't even sure what I was asking. "Why didn't you love me enough? Why did you let her do this? Why did you give up on us so easily?" Derek finally looked at me, and I searched his face for any sign of the man I'd married, the man who'd laughed with sauce on his chin and promised to love me forever. "It's for the best," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of everything we'd been to each other. Just those 4 empty words. I walked out without saying goodbye. Dad was waiting by the truck, and we drove away from that house, from that neighborhood, from that life I'd been building, in complete silence. I watched it all disappear in the side mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it vanished completely, and I wondered how I'd gotten here, how I'd become the kind of woman who got kicked out of her own house, who'd let herself become so small and insignificant that her husband could just decide she didn't matter anymore. Dad's house in Oak Cliff looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left for college 10 years ago. Same faded yellow siding, same chain-link fence around the small yard, same cracked driveway with grass growing up through the concrete. The neighborhood had gotten rougher over the years, more rundown, But Dad refused to move, said he'd paid off the mortgage and wasn't about to start over somewhere else at his age. He helped me carry the boxes inside to my old bedroom, which he'd been using as a storage room, filled with boxes of his own and car parts and tools. "I'll clear this out," he said, already moving things around, making space. "Give me a day or two, and it'll be good as new." I stood in the doorway, looking at the room where I'd spent my teenage years, and felt like I was moving backwards in time, unraveling, becoming that lost girl I'd been after Mom died. The walls were still painted the light purple I'd chosen when I was 15, the curtains still the same flowered pattern. There was even a poster on the wall from a band I'd loved in high school, the edges curled and yellowed with age. "Dad, I can help," I started, but he cut me off. "You've had a hell of a day. Go take a shower, get cleaned up. I'll order us some pizza and we can talk after." I did as he said, standing under the hot water in the small bathroom with its ancient fixtures and tiles that needed regrouting, washing away the sweat and tears, and feeling of Derek's hands on my shoulders the last time he'd hugged me, back when he still touched me with affection instead of obligation. When I came out in clean clothes, the bedroom was already half cleared, boxes stacked in the hallway, and I could smell pizza coming from the kitchen. Dad had set up at the small kitchen table with paper plates and napkins, a pizza from Campisi's, the place we used to go to for special occasions when I was growing up. We ate in silence for a while, the only sound the oscillating fan in the corner fighting against the heat. And finally Dad said, "You want to tell me what really happened?" So I did, all of it. Patricia moving in, Derek changing, the slow erosion of my marriage until there was nothing left but resentment and his mother's voice in his ear. Dad listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker and darker. And when I finished, he pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair. "That son of a bitch," he said quietly. "And his mother's no better. You don't treat people like that. You don't kick your wife out of her own home because your mother doesn't like her." "He said we made a mistake getting married," I said, and saying it out loud to my father made it hurt all over again. Maybe he's right. Maybe we were too young. "Bullshit," Dad said flatly. "You weren't too young. He's just too weak. Takes a weak man to let his mother run his life, let her destroy his marriage. Your mother would have had some words for him, I'll tell you that." He hardly ever mentioned Mom, and hearing him say her name now made my throat tight. "I thought he loved me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I really thought we were going to make it." "I know, honey, and I'm sorry, but you listen to me now." He reached across the table and grabbed my hand, his palm rough and calloused from years of working with his hands. "This isn't your fault. You hear me? You did nothing wrong. You were a good wife to that boy. And if he couldn't see that, if he chose his mama over the woman he married, that's on him, not you." I wanted to believe him, but all I could think about was how I must have failed somehow, must have not been enough, not been what Derek needed. "I should have tried harder," I said. "Should have been more patient with Patricia, should have—" "No," Dad said firmly. "No, you don't get to do that to yourself. You don't get to make his failures your responsibility. He made vows to you, Sarah, in sickness and health, for better or worse, all that. He broke those vows, not you. And now you're going to pick yourself up and figure out what comes next." "I don't know what comes next," I admitted. "I don't even know where to start. You start by staying here as long as you need to. This is your home. Always has been. Always will be. Then you get yourself a good lawyer, someone who will fight for your half of that house and everything else you're entitled to. And then you build a new life, better than the one you had, because you deserve better than a man who doesn't know a good thing when he has it." We finished the pizza and cleaned up together, moving around the small kitchen in a rhythm that felt familiar, despite all the years I'd been gone. Dad insisted I take his bedroom, said he'd sleep on the couch, and we argued about it until I was too tired to argue anymore and just gave in. I fell asleep that night in my father's bed, in my childhood home, feeling both safe and completely unmoored, like I was floating in dark water with no idea which way was shore. The next few days passed in a haze. I called in sick to work, unable to face my colleagues and their questions about why I looked like hell, why I couldn't concentrate. My job at a marketing firm downtown suddenly seemed completely insignificant. Just another thing I'd been going through the motions with, pretending everything was fine while my life fell apart. I spent most of my time in my old room, which Dad had cleared out completely, making it mine again, and I unpacked my boxes slowly, finding places for my clothes and books and all the little pieces of the life I'd had before Derek decided he didn't want me anymore. Dad went to work in his garage every day like always, restoring a '67 Mustang he'd bought at auction, but he'd come in regularly to check on me, bring me lunch, sit with me for a while without saying much. His presence was steady and uncomplicated in a way nothing else in my life had been lately, and I started to remember why I'd always felt safe here as a kid, even after Mom died, and everything else felt uncertain and scary. On the 4th day, I finally called a lawyer. Rebecca Chen had been recommended by a coworker once. Supposedly she was tough and didn't take any crap, which was exactly what I needed. Her office was in a high-rise downtown, all glass and steel and expensive furniture, and I felt completely out of place sitting in her waiting room in my jeans and t-shirt. But when she called me back to her office, she didn't seem to judge. Rebecca was maybe 40, perfectly put together in a tailored suit, her long dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She listened to my story with a legal pad in front of her, taking notes, her expression neutral. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "First thing," she said, "you need to understand that Texas is a community property state. That house is half yours, regardless of whose idea it was to buy it or who's living there now. Any assets acquired during the marriage are split 50-50 unless there's a prenup, which you said there isn't." "He can't just kick me out?" I asked, needing to hear it confirmed. "Legally? No. What he did was completely improper. You have every right to return to that home right now if you want to. In fact, I'd recommend it. Leaving was the worst thing you could have done, legally speaking. It makes it look like you abandoned the marital home." The words hit like a punch. I didn't abandon anything. He told me to leave. His mother, I understand. But the court doesn't care about his mother or what she said. They care about documentation and actions. Right now, you left voluntarily. That's how it will look on paper. She softened slightly, seeing my distress. "But we can work with this. We'll file immediately for divorce and temporary orders. Establish that you were constructively evicted from your home. Request temporary support and exclusive use of the marital residence." "I don't want to go back there," I said. The thought of returning to that house, facing Derek and Patricia, trying to live there while everything was hostile and awful, made me feel physically sick. "Then we'll push for a sale and division of proceeds. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. Your husband has already shown he's willing to put his mother's wishes above your rights. Men like that don't suddenly become reasonable when lawyers get involved. You need to prepare yourself for a fight." I nodded, feeling numb. "I just want what's fair. I don't want to hurt him. I just want my half of what we built together. Fair is what we'll fight for," Rebecca said. "But you need to start documenting everything. Every text message, every email, every conversation. Get statements from your bank accounts, credit cards, everything. And Sarah, don't talk to him unless your lawyer is present or it's in writing. He gave up the right to your courtesy when he kicked you out." I left her office with a retainer agreement and a list of documents to gather, feeling slightly more in control but also terrified of what was coming. The idea of divorce had been abstract before, something Derek had mentioned, but that hadn't felt real. Now it was real, with lawyers and paperwork and legal strategies, and I couldn't quite believe this was my life now. When I got back to Dad's house, he was in the garage, bent over the engine of the Mustang, his hands black with grease. He looked up when I came in, read something in my expression, and straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "How'd it go?" "She says I shouldn't have left the house, that it makes it look like I abandoned it." Dad's jaw tightened. "That's horse shit. He forced you out." "I know. But apparently what I know and what I can prove in court are two different things." I sat down on an old stool by his workbench, suddenly exhausted. "Dad, what if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough to fight him?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at me with those steady gray eyes that had seen me through every crisis of my life. Then he said, "You want to know why I never remarried after your mother died?" The change of subject surprised me. "You loved Mom. You didn't want anyone else." "That's part of it," he agreed. "But the bigger part is I knew I couldn't be the kind of man your mother deserved. Not without her here making me better. She was the strong one, Sarah. I was just the guy who was smart enough to follow her lead." He set down the rag and came over to me, putting his greasy hands on my shoulders. "But you're like her. Got that same steel in you, even if you don't see it right now. Your mother wouldn't have let anyone push her around, wouldn't have given up on what was rightfully hers, and neither will you." "I feel like I already let them win," I said, my voice cracking, "because you're hurt and tired and dealing with a hell of a lot. But hurt and tired don't mean beaten. You're going to rest, you're going to get your strength back, and then you're going to show that boy what it costs to underestimate you." I let myself believe him. just for a moment. Let myself imagine that I could be that strong, could come through this intact. What if I don't even want half that house anymore? What if every time I think about it, all I can see is her face looking at me like I'm nothing? Then you sell it and take your money and you build something new, something that's all yours. But you don't let them cheat you out of what you earned. You worked for that house same as him. Your name's on that deed same as his. Don't let them make you feel small enough that you walk away from what's yours. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the divorce proceedings with a determination that surprised me. Rebecca filed all the paperwork, and Derek got served at the house by a process server who told Rebecca later that Derek had looked shocked, like he'd expected me to just quietly go away. His mother had been there too, apparently, and had tried to take the papers herself, claiming to be his representative, which the server had refused to allow. Derek hired his own lawyer, some guy his mother had found, and the negotiations started. Rebecca had been right. It got ugly fast. Derek claimed I'd abandoned the house voluntarily, that I'd been unhappy in the marriage for years, that I'd never gotten along with his mother, and had made both their lives miserable. Reading his statements, seeing our marriage reduced to lies and distortions, hurt worse than the actual breakup in some ways. But I had documentation too. Bank statements showing I'd paid exactly half of every mortgage payment, utility bill, expense for the house. Texts from Derek early in our marriage calling me baby and sweetheart, telling me he loved me, making it clear this had once been a real relationship. Emails about house decisions we'd made together, proving this had been our home, not just his. The worst part was running into people who knew both of us. Derek's version of events had spread through our social circle, and I could see in people's faces that they believed him, or at least believed enough of it that they looked at me with pity or disapproval, or uncomfortable uncertainty. I stopped going to the gym we'd belonged to together, stopped shopping at the grocery store near our old house, created a new life that didn't intersect with any of the old one. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into my projects at the marketing firm, staying late, volunteering for extra assignments, anything to keep my mind occupied. My boss, Jennifer, called me into her office one day about 6 weeks after I'd moved out, concern written all over her face. "Sarah, I know you're going through something," she said gently, "and I appreciate your dedication. I really do. But you're running yourself into the ground. When's the last time you took a day off?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "I'd rather be busy." "I get that. But busy and healthy are two different things. You've lost weight. You have circles under your eyes. You look exhausted. Take some time. A week, at least. Go somewhere. Do something that isn't work or legal paperwork. You're no good to me or yourself if you burn out completely." She was right. I knew she was. But the thought of having empty time to fill was terrifying. As long as I was working or meeting with Rebecca or dealing with the divorce, I didn't have to actually feel anything. Didn't have to process what had happened. "I'll think about it," I promised. That night, I came home to find Dad on the phone in the kitchen, his voice raised in anger, which was unusual enough that I stopped in the doorway. "You tell that boy if he comes around here harassing my daughter, he's going to have a problem with me," he was saying. "I don't care what his lawyer says. I don't care what his mother thinks. He lost the right to contact her when he kicked her out of her own house. You got that?" He saw me then, and his expression softened a little, but the anger was still there in his eyes. He said something else into the phone, short and clipped, then hung up. "What happened?" I asked. "That was Derek. Called here looking for you, saying you weren't returning his calls and he needed to talk to you about the house." Dad's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. I told him all communication goes through lawyers now. He didn't like that much. Started going on about how he just wanted to be reasonable, work things out, all this bull. I told him reasonable would have been not kicking his wife out in the first place. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number that I somehow knew was Derek from a new number since I'd blocked his old one. "We need to talk. Please. This doesn't have to be so complicated." I showed it to Dad, who shook his head. "Don't respond. That's what your lawyer said, right? Nothing in writing except through her. He's never going to understand why I'm so angry," I said, deleting the text. "He actually thinks he was being reasonable, that this was all some mutual decision we made together. That's what people do when they know they're wrong but don't want to admit it. They rewrite history until they're the good guy." I told Jennifer the next day that I'd take that week off, and on a whim I called my sister Melissa in Phoenix. We weren't particularly close. The age gap and distance and the way we'd both dealt with Mom's death differently creating walls between us. but she'd been texting me supportive messages since she'd heard about the divorce, and maybe it was time to let someone besides Dad see how broken I was. "Come visit," she said immediately when I mentioned I had time off. "Seriously, come out here for the week. Get out of Texas. Get some perspective. The kids would love to see you." So I booked a cheap flight and told Dad I'd be gone for a week, and he looked relieved that I was finally doing something for myself. Phoenix in October was cooler than Dallas, dry heat instead of humid, and Melissa picked me up from the airport in her minivan with her 2 kids in the back, 8 and 10, arguing about something on an iPad. Her house was in Scottsdale, a nice suburban development that looked disturbingly like the neighborhood I'd just been kicked out of, all neat lawns and 2-car garages and basketball hoops in driveways. Her husband Tom was a software engineer, made good money, and they had the kind of stable, comfortable life I'd thought I was building with Derek. That first night after the kids were in bed, Melissa and I sat on her back patio with glasses of wine, the desert stars impossibly bright overhead, and she said, "So tell me everything, not the sanitized version you've been giving me in texts, the real story." And somehow, maybe because of the distance or the wine or just because I was so tired of carrying it alone, I told her, all of it. The slow erosion of my marriage, Patricia's constant undermining, Derek's weakness, the humiliation of being kicked out, the fear that I was going to lose everything I'd worked for, the exhaustion of fighting. Melissa listened quietly, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I'm going to say something, and you might not want to hear it." "Okay," I said warily. Mom would have left earlier. The moment she saw how he was changing, how he was choosing his mother over his wife, she would have walked. You know that, right? I did know that. Mom had been independent and strong, had never tolerated disrespect or being made small. But she and Dad worked, I said. They were happy, because Dad worshipped her, because he saw her strength and loved her for it instead of trying to diminish it. Derek wasn't like that. And honey, I'm sorry, but maybe you ignored the signs because you wanted it to work so badly. Are you saying this is my fault? The words came out sharp, defensive. No. God, no. It's his fault, and his mother's fault. I'm just saying maybe there's a lesson here about not settling, about recognizing when someone isn't capable of being the partner you need. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You're going to get through this. You're going to get your half of everything you earned. And then you're going to be more careful about who you trust with your heart. The week in Phoenix helped. Being away from Dallas, from the constant reminders of my failed marriage and the legal battle and the weight of everyone's opinions, let me breathe for the first time in months. I played with my niece and nephew, went hiking in the desert with Melissa, sat by her pool reading books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I started to remember who I'd been before Derek, before the marriage, when I'd been just Sarah, not Sarah the wife or Sarah the defendant or Sarah the woman who got kicked out. When I flew back to Dallas, Dad picked me up from the airport, and I could see him studying my face, looking for signs that the trip had helped. "You look better," he said finally, pulling into traffic. "I feel better," I admitted, more clear-headed, like maybe I can actually do this. "Course you can," he said. Never doubted it. Rebecca called me 2 days later with news. Derek's lawyer had made an offer. He'd buy out my half of the house at the appraised value. I'd walk away with my half of the savings and retirement accounts, and we'd be done. No fighting over furniture or wedding gifts or any of the other material crap marriages accumulate. Clean break, she called it. "What do you think?" I asked her. "I think it's fair. More than fair, actually. I think his lawyer probably told him he had no chance of winning if this went to court, that his story about you abandoning the house wouldn't hold up. This way he gets to keep the house, which is probably what his mother wants, and you get your money without a long, expensive battle. So I should take it. That's your decision. But if you're asking my professional opinion, yes. Take the money, close this chapter, move on." I thought about that house, about the kitchen I'd renovated, and the yard I'd planned gardens for, and the bedroom where I'd slept next to a man who'd promised to love me forever. And I realized I didn't want any of it anymore. Didn't want to fight for a place that held nothing but bad memories now. Didn't want to win just to prove a point. I wanted my half of what I'd earned, and I wanted to be free. "Let's take it," I told Rebecca. "Let's be done." The paperwork took another month to finalize, attorneys going back and forth over details, signing and notarizing and filing. Derek and I never spoke directly. Everything went through Rebecca and his lawyer, cold and professional, and absolutely final. On a Wednesday in late November, the day before Thanksgiving, Rebecca called to tell me the judge had signed the decree. I was officially divorced. I sat in my old bedroom in Dad's house, the same room where I'd cried myself to sleep so many nights after Mom died, where I'd dreamed about my future as a teenager, where I'd retreated to lick my wounds after my marriage imploded, and I felt absolutely nothing. No relief, no sadness, just a strange, empty numbness. Dad knocked on the doorframe, came in without waiting for permission. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done." He sat down on the bed next to me. "How do you feel?" "I don't know. I thought I'd feel something. Happy or sad or angry or something. But I just feel tired. That's normal. You've been fighting for months. You're allowed to be tired." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "The settlement check cleared yesterday. Rebecca told me when she called. That's a good amount of money, Sarah. Enough to start over, right? If you do it smart." I had been trying not to think about the money, about what came next. It was easier to just focus on getting through one day at a time. But Dad was right. I had options now that I hadn't had before. "I think I need to find my own place," I said. "You've been amazing letting me stay here, but I need to stand on my own feet again." "No rush," he said. "But when you're ready, yeah, build your own life again. Maybe better than the one you had." That Thanksgiving was just the two of us, small and quiet. Dad cooked a turkey that was slightly dry and mashed potatoes from a box. And we watched football and didn't talk about Derek or the divorce or anything heavy. It was exactly what I needed, that normalcy, that reminder that life went on even after everything fell apart. I started looking for apartments the next week. Something small, but mine. Something in a part of Dallas I'd never lived in before, with no memories attached. I found a one-bedroom in Deep Ellum, the artsy part of downtown that was gentrifying fast. All brick buildings converted to lofts and trendy restaurants and street art. It was more expensive than I'd planned, but I fell in love with the exposed brick walls and the huge windows that let in floods of natural light. Moving in was strange. All my furniture was still at the old house with Derek, so I had to start from scratch, buying a bed and a couch and dishes, and all the mundane things that make a place livable. But there was something liberating about choosing everything myself, not compromising or considering anyone else's taste, just picking what I liked and what made me happy. I painted one wall in the living room a deep teal that Derek would have hated, would have said was too bold, too much. I hung artwork I'd been too afraid to buy before because it wasn't his style. I bought plants and actually kept them alive, lining the windowsills with green-growing things that made the space feel alive. Work got better, too. Jennifer promoted me to senior account manager, gave me a raise and more responsibility, told me she'd been impressed with how I'd handled everything, how I'd kept showing up even when my personal life was in shambles. I threw myself into the new role, building campaigns and managing clients and proving to myself that I was good at something, that I had value beyond being someone's wife. I started running in the mornings, something I'd done in college but had let go after marrying Derek. There was something meditative about it. Just me and my feet hitting pavement and my breath in my lungs and the city waking up around me. I ran through the Trinity River trails, past homeless encampments and under bridges covered in graffiti, and felt more alive than I had in years. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I went on my first date. His name was Marcus, a graphic designer I'd met through work, and he was funny and kind and nothing like Derek. We got drinks at a bar in Uptown, talked for hours about everything and nothing, and when he walked me to my car at the end of the night and asked if he could see me again, I said yes. It didn't work out with Marcus. We dated for a few months before realizing we were better as friends, but that was okay. The point was, I'd been ready to try, ready to trust someone new with pieces of myself I'd thought Derek had broken beyond repair. I dated a few other men over the next year. Nothing serious, just learning how to be single again, how to make decisions for just myself, how to recognize red flags I'd ignored before. Dad and I got closer during that time. I'd drive over to Oak Cliff every Sunday for dinner, and we'd cook together and watch movies and talk about everything from politics to cars to my dating life, conversations we'd never had when I was younger. He told me stories about Mom I'd never heard, showed me old photos I'd forgotten existed, helped me understand that she'd been more than the sick woman I remembered from the end, that she'd been strong and vibrant and fully human. One Sunday, about 18 months after the divorce, Dad and I were working on his Mustang together, me handing him tools and learning more about engines than I'd ever thought I'd know, when he said casually, "Ran into Derek at the hardware store yesterday." My hands stilled on the wrench I was holding. We never talked about Derek anymore, both of us having an unspoken agreement that he was in the past and best left there. "Oh yeah?" He was with his mother. She was telling him which screws to buy. Dad's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the judgment underneath. He looked tired, older, like he's not sleeping well. I thought about that, about Derek still living in that house with Patricia, still having her run his life, and I felt nothing but a distant pity. Good, I said finally, and I meant it. Not in a vindictive way, but in an acknowledgement that actions have consequences, that you don't get to hurt people and walk away unscathed. He asked about you, Dad continued, wanted to know how you were doing. I told him you were doing great, which is the truth. Told him you'd moved on with your life and were happier than you'd been in years. The look on his face, Dad shook his head. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. What did his mother say? Nothing. Just looked like she'd bitten into something sour. I think she realized her precious boy isn't as happy as she thought he'd be without you. I laughed. Couldn't help it. She got exactly what she wanted. Him all to herself. No competition. And he got what he deserved. A small life with a small-minded woman controlling everything he does, while you, Dad gestured around the garage, but I knew he meant everything. My apartment, my job, my new life. You got free. That night I drove home to my loft in Deep Ellum, parked on the street where music spilled out from the bars and restaurants, where people were laughing and living their lives, and I looked up at my windows, glowing with warm light in the darkness. My home, my space, mine. I thought about the girl who'd cried on this same street almost 2 years ago, carrying boxes and feeling like her life was ending, and I realized Dad had been right all along. I did have that steel in me, that strength I'd inherited from my mother. I just needed to lose everything to find it. The divorce had taken so much from me. My marriage, my home, my sense of security and trust. But it had also given me something invaluable. It had shown me I could survive the worst thing I could imagine at the time. It had taught me to stand up for myself, to value my own worth, to recognize when someone wasn't treating me with the respect I deserved. Derek had kicked me out thinking I'd crumble, that I'd beg to come back, that I'd accept whatever scraps he and his mother were willing to offer. Instead, I'd gotten up, dusted myself off, and built something better. And yeah, it had been hard and lonely, and there were still nights I cried myself to sleep. But those nights got fewer and farther between as time went on. I still saw Rebecca occasionally for lunch, this woman who'd been my warrior during the worst time of my life, and had become a friend after. She told me Derek had tried to date, that mutual friends had reported he seemed lost, that he'd apparently told someone he'd made a mistake letting me go. That information should have felt like vindication, like victory, but mostly it just made me sad for him, stuck in that pattern of weakness that had destroyed our marriage. On the 2-year anniversary of being kicked out, I threw a party in my loft. Nothing big, just some coworkers and friends I'd made since the divorce. People who knew me as just Sarah, not Sarah the divorced or Sarah the victim. We drank wine and ate too much takeout and laughed until my sides hurt, and at some point I looked around at these people in my space, at this life I'd built from nothing, and felt genuinely happy for the first time since I couldn't remember when. Dad came to the party, looking out of place in his flannel shirt among my hip downtown friends, but game for anything. At one point he pulled me aside on the balcony, just the two of us looking out over the city lights, and said, "Your mother would be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you," I said, meaning it. When you showed up that day and said I was coming home, when you let me fall apart and then helped me put myself back together. That's what family does, he said simply. We show up. Later that night, after everyone had left and I was cleaning up paper plates and empty bottles, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I heard you had a party. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm sorry for everything. I hope someday you can forgive me. Derek." I stared at the message for a long time. This man who'd once been my whole world, and was now just a stranger asking for forgiveness he hadn't earned. I thought about responding. Thought about telling him that forgiveness wasn't something you asked for. It was something you earned through genuine change and understanding of the hurt you'd caused. But in the end, I just deleted the message and blocked the number. Some bridges should stay burned. Some chapters should stay closed. And some people don't deserve the space in your life or your head, no matter how much they might regret losing you. I went to bed that night in my bedroom with its teal walls and plants on the windowsill and sheets I'd picked out myself, and I slept soundly, dreamlessly, the sleep of someone who'd stopped running from her past and started building her future. The road had been brutal, and the losses had been real, But I'd made it through to the other side and discovered something crucial. I didn't need Derek or his mother's approval or anyone else's validation to know my worth. I'd learned to carry myself,